Welcome back, everybody. So we now have two response papers, beginning with Dr. Paul Weller, and then followed immediately by Professor Paul Fidders, and then we'll have time for Q&A after we've heard both of those papers. So I'll hand over straight to the first Paul.
Thank you. The configuration of this room has changed so that once upon a time the clock used to be there. It's now here, but I'm reliably informed that somebody will rescue me from myself if I go on for too long, because we want to have a good discussion with each other. So, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to engage with this important collection of papers on the church, the far right, and the claim to Christianity. I think we've already noted something about the timeliness of this book, and it's great that SCM brought that forward in the light of the violent attacks on asylum seeker hostels and Muslims and their places of worship that took place predominantly in England and Northern Ireland at the end of July and beginning of August. Those events were, of course, joined in with by many who were not themselves members of or necessarily sympathisers with far-right groups or ideologies. Nevertheless, I'd argue that the events concerned were far from what at the time even the BBC headlines framed as far-right protests descending into violence, because it seems to me there was clear evidence that what took place was specifically organised and specially targeted. As publishers with a primary Anglo-American market, SCM will also be aware of the potential relevance of this book to the culture wars currently underway in the USA, in which aspects of the claim to Christianity are being deployed and will come to a head around the presidential election on the 5th of November. And therefore it's very good that the Centre for Baptist Studies will kindly be making a recording of this seminar available on its YouTube channel, so that North American friends and others not able to be here today will be able to access it, because I think it will be of help to them. But this book is also very timely when seen from other international perspectives. And in this I now speak as one who, after a number of years of having been dual resident across Germany and the UK, since the end of July have become a dual German-British citizen. And with regard to that, the popular wisdom of the English language offers pertinent reminders, both that the grass is not always greener on the other side, and also there's the possibility of having jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. And that's not least because in my adopted country, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, the federal party of which is classified by the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution as a suspected threat to the Constitution, and its youth wing and state parties in Thuringia and Saxony are classified as right-wing extremists, has nevertheless seen an inexorable rise in public and electoral support, most recently reaching levels of over a quarter of the votes cast in the three eastern states of Brandenburg, Saxony and Thuringia, which recently had regional elections. Overall, then, I think the contextual relevance of this book cannot be gainsaid. And it's good that the rollout of its publication is accompanied by a series of seminars, including responses of various kinds, and this particular one by the Centre for Baptist Studies, where, at least in what I respond, I'm not going to attempt to respond to the book as a whole because it's written by different authors in any case, but also because this recommendation, number 10, churches in the dissenting tradition should seek creative ways to draw on the deep values of dissent and democracy that they embody, and to articulate these in fresh ways to their congregations of today and tomorrow, is, I think, what's very appropriate from this Centre for Baptist Studies sponsorship of this event, and I think particularly pertinent to the claim to Christianity that is being made by some far-right groups and which is also being amplified in the echo chambers of the wider right-wing populist environment. And so my focus will be on that. And I want to begin by noting, though, what is perhaps a truism, but which nevertheless bears repeating, which is that theology is always formed at the interface between a broader tradition and a personal and contextual appropriation of it. And insofar as I've given the title to my paper, it is Between Anti-Racism, Anti-Fascism and Dialogue, a reflection on practice informed by the Baptist Christian tradition. And as well as in the title, that will be reflected partly in the structure of the paper. So the opening part of my paper, I'll try to suggest some headlines of the distinctive ways in which I think that the heritage of Baptist Christian theologies and ecclesiologies can have important things to contribute to the debate around the concerns of this collection. This will, of course, only be a kind of light hors d'oeuvre before the main course will follow from Professor Fiddes, an eminent Baptist theologian, because I can't hope to match the more systematic way that I'm sure he will go about this task. But it's also because of a choice I've made for the second part of my paper to include some more biographically rooted reflections on individual practice over the last 45 years or so, as someone who's tried to be in different ways engaged with anti-racist, anti-fascism and with interreligious dialogue in ways that have at least implicitly and in part been formed by aspects of the Baptist Christian heritage. So, while the vast majority of Christians of whatever kind, I'm sure, would clearly want to dissociate themselves from the violence that happened this past summer, one of the key pillars of both the organised far right and also of wider right-wing populisms is the differentiation of our way of life as a nation and or religion from that of others, especially Muslims, even when they are either citizens or members of wider civil society. In this context, I'd suggest that aspects of a more Christendom vision of society and support for what Stuart Murray calls its vestiges can have a tendency, even if not intentionally, to support the ideological positions and projects of the far right and its claim to Christianity, as well as to reinforce such thinking in the wider environments of right-wing populism. So as an example of this, during a research project I directed just over a decade ago now on religion and belief discrimination and equality in England and Wales, in an interview with a Church of England priest around the question of fairness and unfairness around religion and belief in the media, the respondent both poignantly and I think disturbingly stated the following: it's almost like losing the empire all over again. It's just that it's the empire of your own country. It's almost like losing the empire all over again, Christian position in society, he was meaning. It's just that it's happening in the empire of your own country. And in speaking in this way, I'd suggest he sadly revealed both the deeply rooted connections between Christendom perspectives and colonialism, but also a nostalgic unpreparedness for living in our world of increasing cultural and religious plurality. And it is on this point that I would argue that the Baptist Christian heritage contains a theologico-ethical vision of a kind that can contribute distinctively to the evolution of an ecumenical Christian praxis that's capable, on the one hand, of challenging the far right and its claim to Christianity, but also of equipping contemporary Christians to live in more faithful, committed, and peaceful ways in a world of ever-increasing diversity of precisely those kinds that the forces of the far right and the sentiments of broader right-wing populisms ultimately see as a threat and want to roll back. So in doing this, it's hard not to begin with Thomas Helwys's remarkable 17th century articulation of a theologically rooted socially inclusive ethics of diversity, as reflected in his famous declaration, quotes, "Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever, it appertains not to the earthly power to punish them in the least measure." In which, of course, by referring to Turks in the language of his time and place, Helwys was referring to Muslims, who have, in our day, become one of the main targets for the contemporary far-right and wider right-wing populist othering, by being portrayed as being alien to social political projects that claim Christianity as a religio-cultural foundation. Helwys's statement affirmed the freedom or belief of the other as having both an individual and corporate, theological and social legitimacy. And this also has clear implications for a social ethic that secures religion and belief freedom from the state and or any other religious body in imposing any required or established form of religion or non-religion. Indeed, if there's anything that comes close to being a Baptist universal, it is this theologico-ethical commitment to the right of religion and belief freedom in combination with the affirmation of social equality between religious groups. Therefore, in his 1999 book, Friends of Religious Equality, Nonconformist Politics in Mid-Victorian England, Timothy Larson underlined in line with this kind of heritage that at least the most radical dissenters of the 19th century argued that such a vision should, quotes, rightly be applied to all citizens, even if they happen to be Hindus, Muslims, Mormons, or atheists. But in considering the relevance of this vision to contemporary far-right tropes around religion and culture, it's important also to understand that such a vision is rooted in a theologically prior conviction that however important nation and family may be, the good news of Christianity is of a fundamentally free, chosen, and responsible destiny, rather than one that is merely inherited or assumed by virtue of being a member of a particular people group, nation, or state. Such a vision is perhaps most clearly embodied in the practice for which Baptists are perhaps best known by others who are not Baptists, namely that of offering Christian baptism on confession of faith. But in relation to which the Baptist scholar and former principal of this college, Henry Wheeler Robinson, underlined that the tradition's, quote, plea for baptism becomes a mere archaeological idiosyncrasy if it not be the expression of the fundamental constitution of the Church. Thus, in advocating for an approach to baptism which differs from what has historically been the main practice in Catholic, Orthodox, and majority Protestant traditions of Christianity, Wheeler Robinson underlined that the Baptist tradition is, quotes, testifying against much more than an isolated and relatively unimportant custom, and is rather, quotes, testifying against the whole complex of ideas of which it was a symbol. Namely, that at best it tended to promote a lack of differentiation between nation, society, and religious communities, and at worst, it allowed the capture of Christianity and of the Church by either projects of nation and or state. So, that such a complex of ideas, as he calls it, in combination with the interventions of far-right groups within the wider right-wing populist environment, can have serious consequences for both church and society, can be seen in the history of what happened to the so-called Protestant Volkskirchen churches of my adopted country of Germany during the rise of the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty, most commonly known in Britain as Nazi Party, in the context of which the National Socialist appropriation and distortion of the central operative symbolisms of Christianity went so far that a minority of Protestants became convinced that the development of a confessing church counter-project was necessary to save the soul of Christianity. But indeed, in order that what I'm arguing about, the potential value to ecumenical Christian praxis of aspects of the Baptist Christian dissenting tradition should not be misunderstood as either making an imperious or ahistorically idealistic claim about how that tradition has always worked out in practice, I'm going briefly to refer to an aspect of that complexity and ambiguity of Baptists in my adopted country during that period. So symbolic of this was the 5th Baptist World Congress. It was hosted in Berlin, 4th to 10th of August 1933. That was in fact only a few weeks after the 30th of June to 2nd of July wave of political assassinations known as the Night of the Long Knives, which cleared the way for what, never forget, had first been an elected government to become something within which Adolf Hitler became able, in the words of his 13th of July speech, again, just before that conference, speech to the Reichstag, in which he presented himself as the supreme leader of the German people. Now, the Congress that met did advocate, even against that background, for the separation of church and state. It decried nationalism and racialism, and it had a commission that met specifically on racialism that strongly condemned both the colour bar in the USA and anti-Semitism in Europe. Having said that, in referring to Hitler, the Congress's official report chose to include the following note. It is reported that Chancellor Adolf Hitler gives to the temperance movement the prestige of his personal example, since he neither uses intoxicants nor smokes. So I think the juxtaposition of that, approving statement, alongside what was actually happening in the context of Berlin when that Congress met, highlights not only the ambiguities, but also the dangers to which those claiming to live within Baptist tradition can be prone when pietistic tendencies come to predominate over a focus on wider Kingdom of God perspectives. As Blake McKinney put it in his 2018 article in the journal Church History on, quotes, "One Lord, one faith, one baptism in the land of ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer," the 5th Baptist World Congress, he said this: German Baptists present difficulties of categorization, as many praised National Socialism for defeating communism, but at other times chastised its anti-Semitism. They were at once both nationalistic and nationalistically suspect, because they arrived in Germany and were seen as a foreign religion. Indeed, in Prussia, Baptists were denied citizenship precisely because they were Baptists and were seen as a foreign citizen, a foreign religion. They were a faith group well versed in varying levels of persecution, but they experienced their greatest liberty of practice to date under a regime renowned for its persecution of the churches. So this, at least in part, explains why within the German Kirchenkampf, the majority German Baptist position was to keep apart from both the German Christian movement, which advocated a Völkisch kind of Christianity, but also from the oppositional confessing church. So, moving now to a little bit more directly biographically informed part of the paper, I note that among other things, the collection, while wrestling with the question of at what point and in what context faithful Christian witness might demand a drawing of a clear line of demarcation with the far right, and indeed opposition to it, as per the confessing church, the question is also asked of whether, and if so, under what circumstances, it might be appropriate for Christians to engage dialogically with those who espouse the political positions of the far right. And it's very easy to look at German Baptists in that period and reach evaluations that the question should be asked of ourselves. I ask it of me, and I will confess there are times I've wondered about compatibilities and incompatibilities, or at least consistencies and inconsistencies between different parts of my Christian practice in this. So to explain and illustrate a little bit in terms of grounding this, well, between 77 and 87, I was also involved in interreligious dialogue. In that period, the main part, I would say, of my personal Christian identity and professional life and work, at that time as an accredited Baptist minister, was expressed in terms of an anti-racist, anti-fascist activism. In the subsequent 3 decades, an engagement with matters of religious and belief freedom, equality and discrimination, and the development of dialogical theory and practice came rather more to the fore in my life until my retirement from full-time university work, after which I've once again started to re-engage more explicitly with anti-racist, anti-fascism. During the late 1970s, the then main political party expression of the far right in the UK was the National Front. And during the early years of my work as a minister in the Tameside Fellowship of Churches in Greater Manchester, the National Front threatened to organise a provocative march through the towns of Duckenfield and Hyde, in which there were significant numbers of people with a South Asian background. In that context, I made what was probably my first conscientised political act of Christian anti-racist, anti-fascism. And this was when a pig's head was left outside the door of a mosque in Hyde. And informed by my perhaps Baptist Christian predilection to affirm freedom of religion of belief as inclusive also of Muslims in the UK, I felt called to visit the affected mosque to express my solidarity with those Muslims and also to take a clear stand against the National Front and the wider environment that had made such an act possible. And in due course, growing out of that in the early 1980s, I became very much involved as an activist in the organisation CARAF, Christians Against Racism and Fascism. Now, that was an example of a Christian initiative that had very clear anti-racist and anti-fascist positions, actually in ways that some other Christians at the time found rather negative, reflecting in its name, being against something rather than for something, and also too combative in style. And also during that period I worked with colleagues from predominantly Jewish and secular backgrounds who at considerable personal risk contributed journalistically to the important and still regularly published anti-fascist magazine Searchlight, which does precisely what its name suggests in terms of shining a light of exposure onto the far right in the UK. And in that period I learned from the experience and warnings of other activists in the field to adopt the practice of whenever the post came, not to open it with my finger, because during that period fascist groups were planting razor blades for unsuspecting people. And this is part of the environment that is part of my history and those of many others. During that period, I wrote an essay called Thinking the Unthinkable and Saying the Unsayable, which was a response to 2 broadly conservative thinkers at the time, John Casey and Roger Scruton, who wanted to reopen the unsayable, by which they meant the debate about repatriation of people that had first been opened by Enoch Powell. Later on, that essay was published in an Anglican Jubilee Publications book under the title The New Right and the Church, with contributions made from Ken Leach, the Catholic anti-racist, anti-fascist Anglican priest, and also David Edgar, who's co-author of this now little book that's just come out, The Little Book of the Popular Right, looking at right-wing populism today. So, without explicitly referencing Baptist Christian perspectives, but certainly in an implicit way informed by them, in a context in which, now I'm talking now, 30 plus years ago, 40 years ago, the discourse of racism and fascism was becoming ever more frequently expressed in cultural and religious terms, to identify our, who are we anyway, way of life with Christianity in such a way that reinforcement was given to policies, practices and attitudes which defined British Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus and Jews as essentially alien. Indeed, at the time, Roger Scruton, in his book The Meaning of Conservatism, made a plea for the importance of religion as a glue of social cohesion in the social order, such that actually he went on to say that in any future religious revivals, quotes, it will be politically important to guide the direction they take, and quotes, the restoration of the church could well become a serious political cause. So, those things are a little bit part of my own history in trying to translate some of these things into practice. Later on, as I say, I became more involved perhaps in terms and through interreligious dialogue, and also in society in terms of religion and belief discrimination and how that impacted on different groups. And during that work, while advocating for freedom of religion and belief, I also advocated for use of the law in curbing such things as incitement to religious hatred. Now, some might think that a readiness to encounter, or countenance rather, such a use of the law could run counter to what I'd so far earlier presented about a Baptist theological vision which has a fundamental confidence in the power of truth to make its own way in public debate. But I'd suggest that actually the mainstream of Baptist Christian tradition also recognised an important role for the law, including its coercive instruments in maintaining the peaceful social conditions needed for free expression and in advancing justice within the wider civil society. So, for example, the Black Baptist pastor and civil rights activist, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is widely known for having advocated the power and the strength to love as being transformative in the struggle with racism. But King did not see that emphasis as being incompatible with the coercive use of law, because, as he put it in a 27th of December 1962 speech in Nashville, Tennessee, quotes, "Judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless." And as we saw over the summer, the use of such restraint of the heartless can be extremely important in giving the Muslims, asylum seekers and others who were targeted by organised far-right activity some restored sense of security. So, in moving towards a conclusion, I want to argue that because of its theological and ethical roots, and notwithstanding its own ambiguities and failures in some of its practice, this Baptist dissenting heritage, at least in principle, offers some creatively distinctive resources in this whole field, especially in terms of when the relationship between religion and nation, state and society become instrumentalized in the service of one another. And in relation to the danger of such projects, I often quote and will cite again now what I think is as good a secular translation of some of the key aspects of what the dissenting tradition has to offer in this regard, from Achin Vanek, an Indian political scientist who wrote a 1992 journal article on reflections on communalism and nationalism in India, and he said this: "To say that politics and religion should be kept separate is understandable, especially at a time like ours. But what it really should mean is that politicians should not use religions for short-term political ends, and religious leaders should not use politicians for narrowly communal gains. But surely every religion has a social and political dimension. To say that religion should be a private affair is to misunderstand both religion and politics. So, in drawing now very briefly and quickly to a close, I just want to say 3 quick things about the spectrum between the struggle against and dialogue with question that was raised in the book, at least from my personal perspective. And in doing so, I'll preface them by wise comments from the other key Baptist founding figure, John Smith, who said, "We are in constant error. My earnest desire is that my last writing shall be taken as my present judgment." 1. My judgment, personally, in the light of all this, in relation to modes of engagement with the far right, is that it is important to take a basic stance of struggle against far-right groups and ideologies. And this is because, using a German term, Völkisch understandings and projects of nationhood and religion need not only careful differentiation from the Christian vision, but they are fundamentally contrary to it and therefore need to be opposed. 2. On the question of the dialogue with the far right, my judgment would be that specifically in relation to its political parties and organisations in the public sphere, the examples in the book around how such can be used and misused, together with Jesus' injunction to Christian disciples to be wise as serpents, as well as gentle as doves, persuades me that this would not be wise. However, and my final point, is that I will also argue that it is possible, and indeed is potentially quite important, to differentiate the question of dialogue with parties and organisations from the possibility of dialogical engagement with individuals, certainly those who vote for such parties and organisations and or advocate right-wing populist tropes, and who may do so out of a variety of motivations. Because the Christian vision of the human is always bigger than whatever one may wish to oppose in a neighbour, and keeping that vision open and that horizon is, I think, an important thing as a Christian contribution. Thank you.